Star Wars has always been inconsistent when it comes to quality. You may get a masterpiece, other times you'll get some bullshit. You don't know what to expect in terms of quality, at least with each installment. I didn't know what to expect before viewing this, and despite the previous two films in the sequel trilogy being among the weaker of Star Wars anything, I still came into this with an open mind. With that, I feel with Rise of Skywalker they finally got it right and pulled off a surprisingly enjoyable Star Wars film. For one, this is easily the best looking out of the entire sequel trilogy, with a lot of beautiful looking landscape shots, with the standouts being the ruins of the Death Star 2 and the armada of Star Destroyers. The action in this is solid and very suspenseful at times. They got that space adventure down that The Last Jedi was severely lacking in, and while I know they aren't everyone's favorites, and they certainly aren't mine, it was nice to finally see Rey, Finn, and Poe together at last on an adventure, and they do have a good camaraderie. The film does a decent job at recapturing that spirit the originals had of just our heroes and the Millennium Falcon going on their whole little space quest. Lando's return doesn't feel forced and further adds to this feeling. Speaking of classic characters, they deal with Carrie Fisher's tragic passing very respectfully, and it feels like Leia's character does come to a natural end. Now, the best thing about this film was how fan-conscious it felt. They finally addressed and dealt with many of the issues the previous two had. For one, they killed and replaced Hux with someone actually intimidating. They made the First Order feel threatening this time by giving them this badass new fleet of Star Destroyers. Rose only has 1 minute of screen time and does nothing, thank God, since she was such a fucking annoying character. It's kind of like how Captain Marvel was barely an endgame. Rey's parents being nobodies was unsatisfactory, so they made her grandfather Palpatine. Without a doubt, the whole Palpatine thing is easily the most shocking part of the entire film. I know people hate that they brought him back, and how they brought him back, and that bringing him back just ruins the originals, but honestly, I think that's what this whole sequel trilogy needed. He was the main villain of the prequels, the originals, and now he's solidifying himself as the overall antagonist of this entire Skywalker saga. The film does use him well to try and fill in the gaps. My only issue with it is that it comes out of nowhere. Nothing built up to this or even hinted at it. I don't even think there were any fan theories that suggested this, which is rather ironic. It's the definition of having a twist just for the sake of having one. That said, I like the way they used him to answer just about everything. The reveal that Snoke was just a clone that acts as a puppet ruler, and hinting that the First Order is just a rebuilt empire was genius. He's still very threatening and definitely has a powerful screen presence, even though he just stays in one place throughout the entire film. Him being Rey's grandfather was a good decision as well, as this made her a much more interesting character. When it comes to Rey, she's often accused of being a Mary Sue, and while she does fit the criteria, my main issue with her is that the character just isn't that interesting. But with Palpatine being her grandfather, this gave her some much needed depth since she is now more susceptible to the dark side, which for me made her more compelling. For me, however, the best character in this and the entire sequel trilogy is Kylo Ren. And you can interpret this being his story, not Rey's, since he sacrifices the most and is the most developed out of anyone. He even ends up dying at the end, which is common for the main character of a trilogy to do. The final battle at the end is really suspenseful since the First Order has so much power over the Resistance, since every Star Destroyer in the Armada is essentially a mini Death Star at this point. Palpatine using his lightning visually looks awesome. Seeing the rest of the galaxy join the fight was cool, as why would anyone allow an empire like this to keep existing in the first place, even though it's 100% unbelievable that a bunch of civilian ships can beat an army of mini Death Stars. And lastly, hearing the voices of the past Jedi was a great fan service, as it felt like they were all collectively using their power to destroy Palpatine once and for all through Rey. Now, allegedly, this is meant to be the final episode in this trilogy of trilogies, and honestly, it's a pretty satisfying finale. It doesn't really compare to other epic finales such as Endgame, Return of the King, Deathly Hallows Part 2, or even Return of the Jedi for that matter, as there's still a good amount of bad stuff that has no right being here. The D.O. droid, voiced by J.J. Abrams, for some reason was utterly pointless. The Force in this doesn't make any sense, granted, it never did for me. There's some new characters that they try to develop or make interesting, but you don't really care about them since they're not that important to the plot. Also, there are these annoying plot conveniences like this fake out of Chewbacca's death and them landing in just the right spot on that moon of Endor, so that when they look through the Wayfinder, it perfectly matches the Death Star 2 ruins. Really? Some things in this are left unresolved, and not like ambiguously, it's more that the writers just forgot or didn't care. Thankfully, it's just unimportant things, like who cared about what Finn wanted to say to Rey in that cave? Speaking of which, the very end where Rey says she's a Skywalker is cheesy as shit. On the topic of that, I really hate this title, Rise of Skywalker. It bothers me when sequels put the word rise in the title when referring to an already established main character, kind of like Dark Knight Rises. The sequel to Tomb Raider was called Rise of the Tomb Raider. It just sounds silly. They should have called it Star Wars The Final Order or Star Wars Endgame. They never had this sequel trilogy properly planned out, yet the film tries to convince you it did constantly and acts as if everything was set up from the very beginning, and you don't buy it for a split second, as that's obviously just not true. This is all unnecessary. Back to this being the final installment in the Skywalker saga, the film still does a good job at wrapping everything up nicely despite its flaws, and I was surprised by how good it turned out to be, and I appreciated the fact that it finally responded to all the problems the previous two had and how it fixed the damage they caused. That said, there isn't a moment in which I believe this will be the last chronological, mainline Star Wars film. I guarantee you within the next 20 years, the Disney overlords will make another sequel trilogy to this, and then another. Each one worse than the last, and the cycle will never end. You can't have a series like this go on forever. It'll run out of creativity eventually and rely solely on nostalgia just to remain relevant. And even that will run out because it already has. Look, I'm a Star Wars fan. There are things I love and things I hate about it, but I'll always be a fan. Yet, this needs to stop. All this oversaturation, this whole we're obligated to make a new Star Wars film every year just because we have to. It's too much. We all know what happens when you don't leave a good series that ended alone. You end up tarnishing it just for money. It happened with Harry Potter, happened with Mass Effect, happened with Land Before Time, and now this. Star Wars needs to die. I know this sounds difficult, but we can still enjoy the good it brought us and leave all this new, unnecessary stuff behind. It doesn't deserve it. If we want this cycle to end, we can't keep supporting these new movies. If we want to truly respect the Star Wars legacy, we must allow it to finally die. Allow it to finally end.